I want to start tonight by highlighting something, which is this. Across lots of cultures and multiple cultures, there is flood stories. There are these stories about this great flood that happened long, long ago. In other words, the flood story that we find in Genesis is not a unique story to the Bible. The details of the story are going to vary from culture to culture, but there's all sorts of cultures that have some kind of story about a flood. We have the Mesopotamians, and they have the story about the flood that they record in this thing called the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can go to the next slide. We're going to compare that story to the Bible story in a bit. We have the Greeks. The ancient Greeks had their own flood story. The Hindus, the Chinese, however you say that word, that one. Even in Africa, in the Yoruba mythology, which is Nigeria area, there is ancient flood stories. And it's probably something we call cultural memory, which is there was an actual flood. There was this great flood, and all these ancient cultures have their own kind of way of recording this event that actually happened. At least this is very good evidence towards the fact that there was this great flood. And it makes this Genesis story just that little bit more interesting. Because if you've been with us for the last week as we've been going through the Genesis series, you know that Genesis isn't this lab report that's like direct, logical, detailed accounting of the exact way and all the fine details of the hows and the whats of how things were created and how things happen. Genesis is a collection of stories. And it's filled with these poetic symbolisms and poems and creative storytelling devices, all trying to point to a truth about who God is and who we are. And that can make it a little bit hard to know if Genesis is talking literally or figuratively. I was with Litem Baalti and Elijah the other day, and Elijah was asking me, like, do you believe Genesis is like literal, like this is exactly how it happened, or is it more just a story to try to tell us something about who God is? Right, like when we think about Genesis and the talking snake or the talking serpent, is it like a literal snake, the way we would picture a snake? Or is it more a symbolic way of describing Satan to kind of tell and emphasize a truth about God or about the story? Right? In this case, I would think the latter. Did the flood that we're going to read about, or that we just read about, that we see in the story, did it really happen? Well, with the cultural stories combined with the biblical story, combined with things like sea creatures, fossils found in deserts, it's a good chance it literally happened. So the answer is Genesis literal or figurative? Both. Sometimes. Sometimes it's literal, sometimes it's figurative, sometimes it's both. And that can get us to kind of wonder, how do we navigate the Genesis stories? How do we know when they're being literal or figurative or both? And it starts by asking the right questions. The kind of questions that the Genesis stories is trying to answer. What kind of questions do you think Genesis is trying to answer? If you've been here, you should know this answer. Who and why? Genesis is trying to answer who and why questions. And this is important because when you try to find answers for questions the story is not trying to answer, you're often going to find yourself empty-handed and frustrated. But when you ask the kind of questions that the story is trying to answer, you're going to discover some powerful truths that are going to be transformative. And so tonight I want to start this conversation around the flood by comparing the biblical flood story versus the Mesopotamian flood story, or what they record in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there's a reason why I want to compare these two stories and not the biblical flood story to any of the other many cultures that have a flood story. Because this story, the Mesopotamian flood story, is the one that the Israelites are going to be most familiar with, right? Context, because context matters when we read the Bible. Genesis is written by Moses. And he's writing this sometime after the Israelites have just come out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And Genesis acts as this divine introduction that God gives to the Israelites about who he is. But because the Israelites have been surrounded by other cultures, other beliefs, other systems, other ways of thinking about the world for so long, Genesis has to do a lot of retelling and reframing of their mind about who God is, who they are, the divine and earth. And so it has to kind of frame how they think about these things. This is for the Bible buffs. Who was the founder of the nation of Israel? Like, who was the first man that the nation of Israel came from? God? No. Not Jacob. It's before Jacob. Jacob is the third one. It's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Abraham was the man that God called out of the land of Ur. And when we look at geography, that land at that time was in Mesopotamia. So in other words, the Israelites' ancestors came out of Mesopotamia. And the Mesopotamian flood story is dated before the biblical flood story. In other words, the Israelites have this idea of what the flood was from this Mesopotamian story. And so God rewrites the flood story in Genesis to retell the story so as to reveal the truth, and even for us centuries later, the truth about who he is, and to correct their incorrect beliefs about God. So the first difference I want to talk about is the reason for the flood. Genesis 6 verse 5 to 6 says this. Next one. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was constantly and totally evil. Next slide. So the Lord was sorry he had ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. See, God created us out of love, to live in his love, and to spread his love. So he created us out of love, to live in love, and to spread love. But the picture we get in Genesis 6 is completely opposite. The picture we get painted is that there's this cycle of wickedness. There's a cycle of evil, and it breaks God's heart because it wasn't the intent. We were meant to live in love, not immerse ourselves in evil. We were meant to live out of love, not perpetuate wickedness. And so God kind of sees this picture, or there's this cycle of wickedness and evil, and any time there's evil or sin or wickedness in our own lives, it breaks God's heart because that moves us out of God's love. It causes us to move away from having our identity in the foundation and rooted on the block of God's love. Instead, we begin to base our identity more and more on things like our achievements, other people's opinions or acceptance, our personal attributes or abilities. And all of these things in some way, shape, or form find their rooting in fear and in insecurity and in pride. And they all operate outside of God's love. And so when we operate from this identity, when we begin to base our identities on these things, over time, we become less and less loving. And we no longer begin to pour out the love of God. Instead, what happens is we begin to pour out a self-defined version of love that never requires us to make true self-sacrifice. And this keeps the cycle of wickedness and evil that causes pain and hurt and brokenness and abuse and mistreat in the world going on and on and on. And God looks at this and he sees and he feels, and it breaks his heart at every person in every community across every nation on the earth that is stuck, that is hurting, that is in pain, that is being abused or mistreated because this constant cycle of wickedness is going on and on. And in Genesis 6, we get to this point where God looks at the cycle and he says, it's enough now. Like, unless I intervene in the cycle of evil and wickedness, it's going to go to the point of no return. And so he has to step in, and he says, I have to step in and break and stop this cycle before it goes beyond redemption. And so in the Genesis story, the reason for the flood is that God's love compels him to intervene in the cycle of wickedness and evil before it goes beyond redemption. In the other story, the reason for the flood is, different. So in the other story, the gods, and that's already a big difference because the Bible is monotheistic, which means it's one God, there is one God, whereas this story, it's polytheistic, theistic, forgive my English, which means there's multiple gods. And these gods don't cause the flood in this other story because of evil. They don't cause it because of sin. They don't cause it because of the brokenness and the pain in the world, because of the cycle of wickedness. No, they have a very different reason for starting the flood. Here's an extract from the story that tells us the reason. In those days, the world teemed. The people multiplied, the world bellowed like a wild bull, and the great God was roused by the clamor. Next slide. Earl heard the clamor, and he said to the gods in council, "The uproar of mankind is intolerable, and sleep is no longer possible by reason of the babel." So the gods agreed to exterminate mankind. In this story, what is the reason for the gods wanting to get rid of mankind? They want to sleep. They're annoyed. The noise, the clamor that mankind and life on earth is making has gotten too much for their liking. Right? When you want to exterminate something, or what kind of animal do you call an exterminator for? Pests. Yes, things that are annoying, that are destructive. In other words, you call an exterminator to get rid of pests. I think it's fair to say that in this story, the gods have diddly squat love or care for creation or for humanity. It's a very different picture from a God whose love is compelling him to intervene before things get out of hand. The second difference I want to look at is the flood itself. Genesis 7 verse 1 reads as follows. When Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the second month, all the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky. Okay, let's go to verse 17 and 18. For 40 days, the flood waters grew deeper, covering the ground and lifting the boat high above the earth. And as the waters rose higher and higher above the ground, the boat floated safely on the surface. Let's jump to verse 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock with him in the boat. And he sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. I don't know about you, but the picture when I read this is that there's this mighty flood, but it's in control. There's a controlled feeling to it, right? It's over the 40 days, the water grew deeper, and it began to rise. And this whole time in the story, I almost get the feeling like Noah's at safe. He's never at danger at any point, right? It says the boat floated. That's a very calm word. That's a very safe word, right? When you think floated, you imagine a little boat floating on the lake or the river. You don't imagine a boat in this raging storm. And so the picture the Bible paints is that there's this flood, but God the entire time is in control, and Noah is safe the entire time during this flood. And then it says at the right time, God remembers Noah, and he sends a wind to blow across the earth. I think we have a chocolate back there. You can get it after the service. A chocolate for whoever can tell me what Hebrew word is the Hebrew word for wind. Ruach. Ruach. You said it better than me. Rain got it right. Ruach is the Hebrew word for wind. It's the same word that we saw in Genesis 1 that describes the Spirit of God hovering over the water before creation. It's the same word we saw in Genesis 2 that was the breath of life that God breathed into humanity. And now in Genesis 8, we see the same word used for the wind that God sends to cause those floodwaters to recede so that Noah can go back onto the land. And so there's this connection within each one of the stories of this idea that our life is directly linked to the Spirit of God. In Genesis 1, our very creation is linked to the Spirit of God as the Spirit. In Genesis 2 and 3, our breath of life, our very life, and the image of God in us is directly tied to the Spirit as the breath. And in Genesis 8, the salvation or the deliverance of Noah, of man, is directly tied to the Spirit as the wind. And so as we look at the story, there's this divine picture that God is in control. That even though there's this great flood and so much life has been lost, God is still remaining in control. That God's love for his creation through the salvation of Noah, has overcome his hatred for evil and wickedness. There's a quote from a pastor that I love that sums this up so perfectly. Any moment now. Did I not put the quote in? I did not put the quote in. Okay, don't worry, I know it off by heart, I think. There's a quote from a pastor, Preston Morris, I think. It goes like this: God's immeasurable love for you overcame his immeasurable hatred for sin. And I think it sums it so perfect. God's love in the story of Noah wins out in the end. Even though he has this hatred for all the pain and the brokenness, that this evil and this wickedness in the earth that's been caused, his love still wins out in the end. But when we look at the other story, when we go to that extract, we're going to see a very different picture being painted. Nergal pulled out the dams of the nether waters. A stupor of despair went up to heaven when the God of the storm turned daylight into darkness. When he smashed the land like cud, one whole day the tempest raged, gathering fury as it went. It poured over the people like the tides of battle. Man could not see his brothers, nor the people be seen from heaven. Even the gods were terrified at the flood. And they fled to the highest heavens, and they crouched against the walls like cowering curs. See, the picture here is that even the gods are terrified. The exact opposite of control. That the story, this Mesopotamian story, the gods, out of their annoyance for man, create this flood that then goes out of their control and destroys all of this life. And so when God writes Genesis, I believe there's a deep truth that he's trying to tell to the Israelites and even to us today, that no matter how bad it seems, that in the darkest storms, in the most destructive and devastating circumstances, where there seems to be no hope, no light at the end of the tunnel, when all seems lost, God's love is still in control. And we're all going to face situations that are out of our control. We all know that we can't control everything, right? Right? All right? Do we have any control people in the room? Any control people? You know, those kind of people that we would typically call like type A persons. You have to have your life figured out. You need a plan. You need to know what's happening. You need to know what you're doing, when you're doing it. All right? Things got to be figured out. We got any people like that? All right? We got some people. All right? I'm half like that. But whether you're a control person, whether you're a type A person, as we would call you, or not, the truth is we're all going to find ourselves wanting and in a situation where we're trying to grab and maintain and gain control of a situation that is out of our control. And when you face that situation that is uncontrollable, when you have that feeling of being out of control, it can cause stress, it can cause anxiety, it can cause fear in us. And as we try to grab and get control of the situation, but it continues to grow and to feel more and more uncontrollable, anxiety, stress is amplified. But it might be something like an unexpected end to a relationship that you can't control, that you never saw coming. It could be a health issue that you never knew was going to hit you. It could be a financial situation at home. Or maybe it's just an internal struggle with your mind or your emotions that just seem to continue to grow more and more out of control. And so when, not if, not maybe, but when we face that situation that is out of our control and things are not in our control, we're left with a choice. We can react out of fear and out of stress and try to grab and to gain control of the situation. And many people have done many things that they've regretted. Many people have done many regrettable things in the name of trying to control a situation. Lying, cheating, abusing, mistreating, overindulging in something. Or we can choose to remember the truth that God's love is still in control. And when we remember that truth, when we're faced with that uncontrollable situation and we remind ourselves that God's love is still in control, I don't have to solve or fix this thing in my own strength, that even if the situation doesn't turn out all right, I'm going to be all right. When we react out of that place, when we make decisions and we respond out of that place, we make choices and we respond in a way that is righteous. The third and the final difference that I want to look at tonight is what happens after the flood. Genesis 9, verse 11. Let's go there. Yes, I'm confirming my covenant with you. Never again will the floodwaters kill all the living creatures. Never again will the flood destroy the earth. Then God said, I am giving you a sign of my covenant with you and all the living creatures for all generations to come. Next slide. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. It is a sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. See, in the Mesopotamian story, there's no promise, there's no covenant, there's no assurance after the flood happens that it's not going to happen again or that things are going to be okay. But in the biblical story, God makes this covenant, He makes this promise with man. And He says, even if every thought and every imagination that they have is bent towards evil since they've been a child, never again am I going to release the floodwaters and destroy the entire earth. And He gives this rainbow as a sign of the promise. Now, we read rainbow in our Bibles, but the actual word directly translated is just bow, as in an archer's bow and arrow. And so in the old Bibles, like the old King James, they'll just say bow. That's the actual word there. When you look at a rainbow as God's divine bow, which direction is God's bow pointing? Which direction is it pointing? A rainbow, which direction is it pointing as a bow? Up. Right? If his bow was going to shoot an arrow, which direction is he shooting that arrow? Up. Right? So the arrow is pointed up, heavenwards. In other words, God's divine bow is pointing to heaven and away from the earth. It's pointing away from you and towards Him. And that's exactly what happened. Because the cycle of sin and wickedness and evil still has to be dealt with. And so God came in the flesh as the person of Jesus. And He walked among us, performing miracles and healing and teaching. Before He faced the cross. And on that cross, He died for the sin and the wickedness of the world, for yours and for my sin and my wickedness, and for your wickedness and your sin. And He rose again on the third day as Lord of all. And so as Jesus hung on that cross, God's divine bow shot its arrow and found its mark, but not in us, in Jesus. 1 Peter 3 verse 18 says this: Christ suffered for our sins once and for all time. He never sinned, but He died for sinners to bring them safely home to God. Picture the ark in the story of Noah as a symbol of Jesus on the cross dying for us. See, the punishment or the wages of sin is death. And all have sinned and fallen short. And so we were all facing the flood that is meant to kill us. But God's love overcame His immeasurable hatred for evil. So He provided a way for us. He provided an ark for us, for our spiritual life, in the name and in the person of Jesus, hanging on the cross for us. So that we too, like Noah, can find our way safely home. He suffered physical death, but He was raised to life in the Spirit. Verse 21 continues and it says, and that water, speaking of the flood, is a picture of baptism, which now saves you not by removing dirt from your body, but as a response to God from a clean conscience. It is effective because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.